matters. Who is speaking for Africa and why is it important? My name is OkayAfrica, co-convener of the Africa Soft Power Project, a movement focused on how the continent can optimize its creative industries, knowledge economy, and harness its soft power effectively to propel itself forward, while championing the inclusion of African voices and the voices of the global Black community in global discourse. Our May edition, titled The Bridge, the Past, the Present, the Future, has been specifically timed to begin on Africa World Heritage Day, May 5th, and end on Africa Day, May 25th. Our objective is to establish the celebration of Africa's contemporary industries within wider global conversations, and we therefore invite the whole world to join the celebration of May as Africa Month. This session, Proximity Matters, who is speaking for Africa and why is it important? We'll ask these crucial questions. How do we change Africa's global narrative? How can we reshape how we as Africans see the continent and its contributions? Do African media platforms have a responsibility to challenge negative stories about the continent? We're happy to have Thebe Ikalafeng, who may not be able to make it to us, Mikey Makura, Carol Pineau, Khanyi Mpumlwana, and Tshepo Tshabalala on this panel, and I'm looking forward to their thoughts and perspectives. This conversation will be moderated by the ever-impressive Rachel Hislop, writer, journalist, and editor-in-chief for Okayplayer and OkayAfrica. Really glad to have you here. So I'd like to thank our phenomenal audience for being here today, and of course, thanks to our media and strategic partners for supporting the event. Rachel, it's all yours.
Thank you, Obi, for that great introduction. It is my pleasure to be here with all of you today. And for those who are tuning in from home, I hope you've been enjoying the conference thus far. And I'm sure that you're looking forward to the continuing events throughout the month. So I am Rachel Hislop. I'm based out of New York City. I'm the VP of Content and Editor-in-Chief of Okayplayer and OkayAfrica. And again, I'm so pleased to be a moderator for this panel here today. Today, our goal is to utilize our soft power as members of the media to bring attention to two very important questions. How do we empower Africans to control their own narrative? And what responsibility does African media platforms have to challenge destructive narratives about the continent? We have an amazing panel lined up for you here today with some of the most prominent storytellers that I've ever had the pleasure of sharing a virtual stage with. We'll be discussing some large ideas here today, and I'm asking for everyone to look at it through the lens of our work and through the lens of soft power. For the audience members, please feel free to drop any questions you have in the Zoom chat, and I'll do my best to incorporate them throughout the conversation. Normally, I would go through and introduce everyone, but I think no one can tell their story for themselves. No one can tell a story about themselves better than the person, so I will allow you all to go around and introduce yourselves and not just tell us what you do, but also let us know how you empower Africans through your work. So Tshepo, we're gonna start with you.
Awesome, thanks Rachel. Hi everyone, the name is Tshepo Tshabalala and I head up the Jamlab project based at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. My background is in journalism, financial journalism, working at Forbes Africa, Reuters, and Business Day and Business Live. Currently at Jamlab, where we focus on supporting innovation and the growth of independent media in Africa and diversifying those voices. We do that through 3 programs, namely the Accelerator, where we support media startups in Africa. We have a community of practice where we host events like this, roundtables, workshops, where we chat to media editors and media practitioners about the work they do and the changes that are taking place in journalism on the continent. And thirdly, we document the changes that are taking place in Africa and all the innovations and innovators that are pushing this narrative across the continent.
Awesome, thank you so much for that and thank you for being here. Khanyi, we'll come to you next.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everyone. I'm Khanyi Mpumlwana. I'm the Global Creative Director at the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit behind Wikipedia. My creative history is very long, so I'll make it short. I have a background in advertising. I did a little bit of a stint in radio, and I'm also the co-founder of a nonprofit organization called Find New Words. And my passion is really in behind the storytelling of particularly Black queer narratives, which I feel are severely underrepresented when it comes to the African narrative. And that is something that I have pursued in my long career.
Thank you so much. Welcome. Carol, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm Carol Pineau. I'm a journalist and filmmaker. I had been posted in Nairobi covering the 12 East African nations for VOA, and later in Eritrea for CNN. And then I got tired of telling the story of wars and famines, and decided to produce my own independent documentary called Africa Open for Business. It was in 2005, before anyone knew that there were things like business in Africa. And since then, I've really been working on telling a different narrative and trying to take African stories and feed them to Western audiences in ways that they can understand and appreciate and see something different. And also calling things as they are instead of going with the usual way. I had a talk show on Africa Today TV on current events. I recently hosted a foreign policy podcast, Africa Forward, on infrastructure in Africa, and have continued to do these kinds of stories that really just are aimed at sharing the narrative and a different narrative.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And your bookshelf is impressive as well. And last but not least, Moky, please introduce yourself to the room.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everybody, and thanks for having me on. My name is Mikey Makura. I'm the Executive Director of Africa No Filter, which is a not-for-profit, and we are 1 year old, actually. We just recently turned 1, and thank you. And we've been set up to fight stereotypical, harmful narratives about, but also very equally importantly within Africa. So that's currently what I'm doing now. Prior to that, I used to be head of comms at the Gates Foundation. Prior to that, done many, many things. You haven't got enough time on this webinar because I'm so old to tell you all the things I've done. But suffice to say, what I'm doing now is possibly the most exciting work that we're doing for an organization to be dedicated, funded, and we're well funded to try and shift narratives. It's very exciting. It's a very exciting time.
That is beautiful. Congratulations on your 1 year. We love to hear the word well-funded. I just love the way it feels.
You love the way it feels. I live it. It's brilliant. The only sad thing, none of our funders are African. So that's a huge challenge for us because we are set up to fight stereotypical narratives about Africa, and all our funders are from abroad, but we're working on that.
Absolutely. And I think that sets us up quite nicely for you to take the first question. But before we get there, throughout this, I might be directing some questions directly at some of you. I do want this to be open forum, so feel free to answer any question at any time. You guys, you don't have to keep your mics muted if your homes are silent, because I do want everyone to make this as natural and free-flowing as possible. But Moky, we'll start with you. I'd love for you to take the lead here. I want to start at the beginning. A lot of our internalized bias starts very early in our lives as Africans, and a lot of that is informed by lack of representation from the type of media that we're consuming, just not seeing ourselves in the types of cartoons and books and education that we're getting at a young age. Sorry, see my notes and trying to look at you guys while talking. This is easier in person than it is on Zoom, I swear. So what are some strategies that you've seen employed around marketing Africa as a brand, and how have they impacted global perceptions about the continent?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a really big question about marketing Africa as a brand. And I think, one of the big mistakes that we probably make is looking at Africa as if it's this monolithic single thing. So Africa as a brand is made up, as you know, of multiple countries. And I think it's difficult for us to say, what should Africa mean to everybody? Because it's different things. So I'm not a fan of marketing Africa as a brand. I think we need to break up the pieces, marketing certain countries as amazing tourism destinations, as certain places as, amazing cultural places. Africa is different things. And I think we should move away from marketing it as a single brand, because that's the downfall. When people, you look at, there are 5 examples of insurrections or protests happening, and then all of a sudden Africa is, you know, having a huge issue. You looked at, you know, Ebola. I remember when Ebola, I was in Nigeria at Ebola, when Ebola happened. I remember people not coming to Africa because Ebola is, you know, that's the danger of this phrase, marketing Africa as a brand. But at the same time, there is more that we have in common as Africans that separates us. So there's certain, you know, economies of scale, I guess, is seeing us as, you know, as Africans. But from our perspective, what we are trying to do in terms of how we're showing Africa is that we're not saying Africa is any one thing. The problem is that everybody's been seeing Africa as a single thing. And what we're saying is that it's nuanced, it's contextualized. So if you are going to write about Zimbabwe, you need to talk about, you can't ignore, like, you know, Zimbabwe Lives Matter and all the issues that are happening there. You can't ignore Ethiopia, Tigray, but write about it in a contextualized way. It is not the only thing that happens in any of these countries. And that's the point, that you've got to understand Africa as all the sum of all its different parts. And that way you can't stigmatize us or stereotype us because we're not one thing. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. And we can open it up to anyone else who'd love to join in or add to that.
I think Moky covered everything, and it is the same in journalism, where you have all these different publications focusing on different topics, and the danger in covering or marketing Africa as one thing is we lump countries into certain stereotypes, and that's what we should always aim to try to move away from, especially within journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. We get a lot of this at OkayAfrica when people are like, there's so much more that you can be doing. And I'm like, absolutely. But do you know how much work that is and how vast of an undertaking that is? And you have to really perfect certain markets before you can say, like, we've got everything. It's a really large undertaking. I would like for each of you to speak about your experience as creative leaders in Africa and working around African creativity. What is something about the responsibility of this position that many overlook? Anyone can take it from there.
If I may. I think, I mean, having seen this many times in creative boardrooms, I think we take for granted just how complex people can be and how nuanced they are. And that's the one thing that we overlook many, many times. When we are telling African stories and representing African people, we tend to get a little bit lazy, and we, you know, I mean, I'm pretty sure you've all seen the strategy presentations when someone says, meet Tshepo, he is a 30+ male living in Soweto, and he likes to hang out with his friends on weekends. And then we decide that is exactly what we're going to base this entire creative project on, and we are not going to dig deeper and learn more about who we are as a people and the things that matter to us most. So yeah, I think that the thing that we overlook really is our nuance and just how complex and rich our stories can be.
Does anyone else want to take that? I'd love if all of you could answer it. I know in respective industries, we can encounter different barriers that might seem invisible to the outside world. As creatives, it seems like we're doing all of the glamorous work because people are only seeing the end product. But what are some things that you encounter that are specific to creativity in your field?
I think in journalism, the idea is to write on people's lived experiences and include minority voices. And there are publications who try to include minority voices, but there are others that continually only include those in urban areas. And that's the danger of limiting content. And the other challenge is also language. You see that a lot of our content is in English. Rarely do we find content that speaks to the people on the ground or the people who should be consuming our content. We target our content to only English speaking or Anglophone countries around the world or even on the continent. And I think we need to make an effort within our countries. In South Africa, we need to make a concerted effort in producing content that is in Zulu or Setswana, that will actually touch ordinary people's lives rather than focusing on the people based in the urban areas?
That's actually a question that I had reserved for later in this conversation, but since you brought it up, I think we can talk about it now. What are some of the barriers that you think are in place around creating content in those languages in different countries?
I'll speak. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Moky.
No, I was just going to say that South Africa is in a unique position because it has got 11 official languages. So technically you should be creating content in those languages. But the reality is that actually there's 1 or 2 languages, Zulu and English, Afrikaans, that have the market to sustain this, because it boils down to something that I think we as Africans we don't recognize. Every time somebody has this amazing idea, I'm going to create content, or I'm going to make things that better represents us better, we don't buy it. We are not the consumers of our own products a lot of the time. And that's a big challenge, because I was in publishing, so I speak from just trying to make a living. And I know somebody else who was doing this as a business, trying to create content for kids in different languages. People weren't buying it. People don't buy it. And I think the biggest impediment to creating the kind of content they want often is that there needs to be a market for it. And I think this phrase cultural colonization is a real thing. It is a real thing. Ask anybody, like, of the people who are listening in, when's the last time, it's saying the last 10 movies they watched, how many of them were African versus how many of them were Hollywood? Of the last 10 series they watched, how many of them were Hollywood or from the US? We're not consuming our content. That's the biggest thing that I see. And we are a grant maker. We give money to creatives to try and get them to create things, because a lot of the time they can't monetize their stuff. They cannot monetize it because people don't appreciate art enough, don't go to the theater enough. In fact, where are the performing spaces outside of the big major cities? Dakar, Joburg, Cape Town, a lot of cities in Africa don't have performing spaces. So there's a lot of underlying issues that stop creatives actually making content, and the biggest one of them is how they're going to live on that. But I'll stop there.
I want to add to what Moky's saying, and I'll speak from a South African context. And the difficulty in creating that work is that growing up, the first thing you're taught is learn the language of business, and the language of business is English. So your parents, as they raise you, they teach you at home to speak English, and you end up being fluent in English rather than your mother tongue. You attend school. Most of us attend schools in the urban areas. You'll start being taught in English. English becomes your first language, medium language that you're taught in, whereas your second language becomes Afrikaans, which is well documented, which has books in all libraries, universities teach in Afrikaans. So that market has that following. Whereas, for example, my mother tongue is Setswana. I never had the opportunity to be taught in Setswana. I attended an English school, but I never had the opportunity to say, hey, here's a Tswana teacher to teach you your language, to read and write. I self-taught myself how to read and write in Setswana, but a lot of the time we don't have that upbringing or the teaching from a young age to make us connected to our mother tongues in order for us to promote those languages as we grow up, as we go into industry. In as much as we have 11 official languages, they are not equally promoted in school or in media. And I feel like that's where it needs to change. Going back to secondary education, primary education, where we promote all 11 official languages equally to sort of increase creativity and work in media in those languages.
So do we think that creators have to rethink what type of content they're producing, or is it useful before it's useful to actually promote the language? Oh, sorry, I'm chopping these up from the the chat here. Do creators have to rethink what kind of content they produce to reach people in their native languages?
Oh.
Carol, I can take that. Did you want to speak? Because I just think that, it's all about being sustainable as an artist or content creator. You've got to be sustainable. There are a handful of organizations that give out money to artists, and a lot of them are Western based. Africa No Filter is one of the few that does it here, and we've actually even started this it's a micro grant where we call it the KKA Fund, which by the way is small in Yoruba for any Yoruba speakers on this call, but we're giving out between $500 and $2,000, and it's nothing. It's actually nothing, but it's actually enough for you to create something, because that way we can stimulate the market. And I think it's all about how do you make yourself sustainable. And I think we as Africans have to look at ourselves and how we consume our content. And that's why America does it. Hollywood pays for itself. You know, you don't go to see a Hollywood movie and you're trying to figure out, you know, how are we gonna, you know, make this work. If you get into Hollywood, the market buys that content, they see it. So let me stop there.
Carol, I'd love to hear from you, as much of your work has been in the audio space, which I would assume has its own barriers of entry when it comes to language.
Well, I don't know that I have that much to add on language, but I think the biggest challenge for me is that there sort of is the global consensus of what is Africa. Mm-hmm. And if you try to get outside of that global consensus, then, you know, to be kind of vulgar about it, they say you've gone native. I don't know what's really wrong with that, but that's what you're told. This is a bad thing to see other things. And I think, you know, Moky, I really understand your point that you made earlier about the difficulty of marketing the continent as a whole. At the same time, I have somehow ended up as a journalist working on a lot of countries that are considered the bad ones. And I find that there are often places that are actually really amazing. That are not at all, that have nothing to do with the story that we're told. And that the leaders are actually very rational people, but that they're constantly put in really bad positions and having to, you know, make choices between two really bad decisions. But if you say anything at all good about them, you can't believe the kinds of accusations that you get. You know, and including that they must have been paying you off to do it, and, you know, on and on. It couldn't possibly be that we are just simply wrong about it. And I think that the other thing I see is that African-led development, most of what I do is reporting on African-led initiatives. And the leader, you know, the countries that are really excelling in African-led development, they are the ones who really get hammered. They are the ones that the world does not like the most. And I think that it's that self-empowerment that, you know, you kind of have to smack it down. And I think there is something then where, you know, what I wish is I see Africans themselves smacking them down as well. And that's really disappointing, because I think that those countries need the support of their brothers and sisters as well. And it's hard enough for me out there as a journalist outside to be defending them, but you know, it's hard when you see that, and you see over and over again these countries that are sort of the darlings of the World Bank one day and the scourge of the earth and pariah nations the next day. Mm-hmm. And I think that once you are labeled as a pariah nation, there's really no way you can ever get out of that, because no matter what you do, it will be seen as, you know, there's something wrong with it. Your motives will be seen negatively. So there's no way ever to get out of it. And this is where things are for these nations. And I just see that, you know, for me, the biggest challenge by far is being able to get a counter narrative out without having it being seen as suspect.
Yeah, yeah. Carol, that was a really layered answer. Thank you for that. Moky, did you have anything to add?
I did, but I don't want to dominate. But, you know, we've just done this piece of research called How African Media Covers Africa, because I think we've always had this thing, it's always the West, it's the BBCs, it's the CNNs that are covering Africa wrongly. And we actually found out that over 80% of the articles that we analyzed were hard news stories, event driven. So it was the Tigrays, it was all the negative stuff, it was the political stuff, it's the political elections and the conflicts and all of that stuff. And that is us as Africans writing about ourselves. That's nothing to do with Western sources. But what we did find out was that over a third of all those articles were actually sourced from Western sources. So it was AFP and Reuters. But more interestingly, 40% of the articles were actually bylined. They were bylined by local journalists. But what one of the editors told me is that their journalists would sit and watch the BBC and type up their story based on what was going on, what the BBC was reporting. So either way, to a certain extent, we are not really writing our own story. But what I don't like to see is that, Carol, you talk about, how do we sort of change the reputations of those countries? But if you only cover the politics, you will only get the politics. And unfortunately for us, our African leaders have let us down, because a lot of the time they are responsible for the narrative about the countries, because that's all that's ever covered. If you look at it, people are always reading about politics and elections. There is an election in Africa, at least 5 to 6 at any given month, in any year, because there's 54 countries to cover. So you can actually just get by, and it's all, the coverage on a country spikes when there's an election. But then at the same time, there's a whole bunch of other stuff happening, and that doesn't bubble up. And often it's those publications that claim to cover Africa. And in order to cover Africa, they will take an example of a story happening in one country and just extrapolate it to the continent. For example, there was something that we actually came across, Bloomberg is one of my funders, but Bloomberg News put out a story on COVID variants a couple of days ago. And they were talking about variants, and there's one in South Africa that's bad. Variants as a whole are not bad. There's a couple of handful that have seemed to be bad, but the way they wrote the story as if, Africa was this cesspit of variants, COVID variants that are bubbling up out of the continent. It was so biased. Even the scientists they had to comment, there were two. One was like, hey, this is not so bad, we're just monitoring it. The other was like, oh my God, this is terrible. They gave him 90% of the space in that article. And the person who was like, hey, you know what, let's calm down about this, got 10%. The bias is there. It's implicit in the things they cover. And that's often because you're trying to cover Africa. And I think we just need to delve a little bit deeper and just, what are the other stories happening? What are the other stories happening on the continent? That's where we're suffering right now.
Yes, thank you for that. A little gospel in the afternoon. That was beautiful.
Nighttime here, and I've had my first glass of wine. Don't mind me.
Yes, we're right on time. I do want to talk about responsibility, though, because as I'm listening, as a journalist, what I'm hearing is that funding is sometimes the greatest barrier, right? We aren't going out and doing the reporting because we do not have the funding to hire the reporters, to have them out in the fields. We don't have our own wires that are coming from on the ground that are feeding our newsrooms. These are all things that systems that we have to depend on to be able to tell the stories within the limitations of what we have at our disposals. But outside of that, which is why, Moky, in the beginning, I said to hear fully funded is just like, it's a beautiful sound. Whose responsibility is it to promote and or dispel negative narratives? Is that the responsibility of the politicians, of the celebrities, of the musicians, of the creatives? Who owns that responsibility?
All of us. We are all responsible. We are all agents of the responsibility. And I think the beauty of technology has provided relatively cheap and accessible platforms where citizens, activists can use it to present different views and perspectives. On marginalized communities, on non-elite communities. You have your WhatsApps, your YouTubes, Instagrams, Facebooks. We need to use them. I don't think we need to generally rely on independent or mainstream media for that work to be done. We are all responsible, and we or let me say rather that audiences have become producers of content, and it's not only in the hands of mainstream media. We are all producers, and we should use whatever agency or ideas or connections or collaborations we have to use that to create and that content and be responsible for it. And I think where we lack, where the challenges are, is in the funding. But I feel like we need to start somewhere. Start and grow what you're doing, and hopefully the funding will come.
Yeah, and I do agree. I believe that is somewhat of a utopian approach. Like, we would like to believe that everyone who has the responsibility is responsible and they understand that they have that responsibility, but we've seen that go the other way far too often when people, and I'm going to speak specifically around celebrity musicians, maybe even politicians, they over or underestimate the impact of their words, their actions, what they stand behind, and they scapegoat the media, right? Like you shouldn't be looking at me, go to your local news. And they don't take that responsibility as something serious, and they don't really understand how they're shaping the narrative that everyone is partaking in.
Can I just add, because I think one person that not one person, but a person I think that's really sort of taking it seriously, Burna Boy recently won a Grammy Award, and I remember he was quoted when he won, he said, "We are in the house, Africans, we are in the house," in that we have made it in through the door. Because a lot of time there's this sense of othering that, we're looking at, we're not represented in the media. But I think a lot of celebrities are very aware of their role as Africans and how they're representing the brand Africa. That they're not just there for themselves, they're there for other people. I mean, we had a conversation today with, Sherry Silver, who's the dancer, the choreographer, and she was saying how she wants to use her voice to celebrate Africa. So I think there's a growing number of celebrities who are aware that they need to kind of change that narrative around Africa. And even, who is it? I can never remember his name. He won an Oscar, the Ugandan actor, so a London-born Ugandan. Yeah, who won an Oscar. I mean, he mentioned Uganda. What's the name? Who changed her name from Tandiwe Newton to, there's a lot more of that reclaiming the identity, just realizing, actually, you know what? I'm not ashamed to be African. It's okay to be African. In fact, you know what? Right now, being a Black female African, I'm top of the tree. I've been at the bottom of the tree, but things are flipping. So I think people begin to realize that it's okay to be African. It's that African narrative isn't pulling us back anymore. It's actually kind of making people take an interest right now. But yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I think. Sorry.
Oh, I'm happy to hear from you.
I suppose I believe this narrative discussion needs to be a little bit more systemic. We have to be a little bit more deliberate than just waiting for the likes of Burna Boy to get onto a stage and say, "Hey, I'm so happy to be here. Wow, we made it." And I think, long before Burna Boy, there was Lady Smith Black Mambazo, who also made it to the stage and said, "Hey, we've made it," and then nothing really happened. We have not been pragmatic about, redefining our story. And, to Tshepo's point about the ecosystem of redefining our narrative, it needs to be systemized. The article that was shared with us panelists earlier was about how artists kind of were commissioned to help redefine America during the Great Depression. That was a very deliberate move by policymakers, by political leaders, to create a narrative for America that was averse to what was actually going on in America. And they put money behind it. They put time behind it. They rallied people who have never worked in a room before together and said, "Hey, this is something that we all need to do." And I think we have reached the stage that we need to start doing that. For instance, Wikipedia articles don't exist until an article in the media, in journalism, exists about that topic. So if the journalists aren't empowered enough to write these stories, then Wikipedia volunteers aren't empowered enough to tell these stories on Wikipedia. And the cycle continues, because then the people we want to write about don't get that notability that most people get through Wikipedia articles. And so I think we need to be a little bit more, direct, and we need to plan this narrative thing and not just kind of hope that it'll happen.
That was a beautiful answer. Thank you so much for that. I think that's really great insight. I didn't know that people had to have their name published before the Wikipedia could be made about them. That's really good insight for all of us here. There are a lot of editorial things that can be done to help that along.
Absolutely.
I'm going to jump into
Rachel, can I just add to what Khanyi was saying?
Absolutely.
And I think we need to, as Africans, learn to consume each other's content. And I think that's where the gap is, in that we don't know each other as Africans. I don't know how a Senegalese lives or eats. There's no way I haven't consumed that content from Senegal that brings a positive light on what's happening in Senegal. And I think we as or media, we need to make a deliberate effort in writing about or getting content from other African countries and promoting each other on each other's platforms, rather than waiting for a Western media organization to affirm great food in Senegal before we say, oh yes, food in Senegal is great. I think we need to affirm ourselves and believe in ourselves before we wait for a BBC to write about it before we say it's great. You know, I think that's where we need to be deliberate in. That's I feel like that's the starting point of being deliberate in doing that.
Yeah. It's really the trick of the colonizer that makes us feel like we're all in competition and that we cannot all exist in the same space when there's endless creativity to be inspired by, endless stories to share, endless everything. And we're tricked to understand that we're in competition.
Can I just add on to Tshepo, what you were saying about we need to be consuming each other's content? I mean, Africa No Filter is launching something called Bird, which is it's Africa's first story agency for, I guess, soft stories. I'm not allowed to say soft stories, but it's for, you know, stories of creativity, innovation, and just, it's the non-hard news. It's the political stuff. It's everything else. And that is a service we're offering free to African media. So we're piloting, we're about to start. It'll probably start next month. But it's exactly to that point, because a lot of the media outlets we spoke to, the only access they had to stories about other countries was the hard stuff, which was being covered by the news agencies. So for the first time, we are producing that content. So we are looking for stories because we want to get there before the BBC or CNN elevates stuff. You know,
exactly.
Why do we have to wait for the BBC? So that's what Bird is. What's what we're trying to do anyway. And we need support. We need media outlets to take it because it's free. It's free to media outlets. But you'll be surprised that there is one editor in South Africa that said they have no news outside of South Africa on their pages because, quote unquote, she said, I don't think my readers are interested in the rest of Africa. And that's a very real point. But one of the things that a journalist said to me, who is actually a correspondent for an international publication, like he would pitch a story to the editor and they'd say, oh, no, we've already had our Africa story for the week. So he said what he started doing was pitching a story. He'd say, it's an amazing story. It's about this, it's about that. Oh, and it happens to be in Africa, because the focus became on the story rather than on the location of the story. So we've really taken that and said, we need to do amazing storytelling first, regardless of where that story takes place. It's about the story. We need to learn how to write. We need to learn how to tell stories well, because that's what I think organizations like the BBC and CNN do. They tell the story well. Whereas we see the story and we think, that's not interesting. Let's move on and write about politics.
Yeah.
It's us. It's us.
Yeah.
Can I just add, I'm seeing in the chat there are a number of things about positive stories and, to what you're saying, actually all of you were saying, I think that there is this thing of constantly being told in the media, why doesn't the media talk about positive stories on Africa? And I always think that's really wrong-headed. People tell me that I do positive news on Africa, and I cringe when they say that. I don't think I do positive news. I think I just do news. The issue is that when we talk, if I could tell you about America in a way where you would never want to come here at all. I can tell you about school shootings and, white supremacists, and I can tell you a whole bunch of stories where you won't want to go near the place. No one will want to invest, right? So, you look at the cost of this narrative. The issue is when we talk about the US, when we talk about Europe, we talk about a well-rounded narrative, a multifaceted narrative. We never allow African stories to be multifaceted. And so it's just one story instead of having the multifaceted. Yes, you can have a country that has a conflict and they also have really nice beaches and really nice tourism. And they even have a stock market that is making record-breaking numbers. And, it's amazing how many things all together can be there, but we never allow that. So we just have that one, caricature of what is Africa. And I think one of the things that's really important is to not ask journalists to do positive stories, because we don't do positive stories. That's a publicist's job. Our job is to tell the news. So to say to a journalist, you're not telling positive stories, I always say it's like, telling my husband you don't clean up your socks. Well, he doesn't really judge himself on whether he's, tidy. So he just says, yeah, I don't. Sorry, honey. But if I say to him, you're not a good father, that matters to him. And he goes, no, I am. You need to say to journalists, you are biased. You are telling a lie by omission. You are not telling the truth about Africa. You are not telling the real story by not telling a multifaceted story. That hurts journalists. And then they have to prove, no, I'm not biased. Really, I'm, look at all these other things. And I'm going to start doing these things. And I've seen it over and over again. I've written op-eds where I talk about, as a Western journalist, I can say, we are telling lies by omission. And all of a sudden the publication will start writing about business in Africa magically. So this is a play to say, let's not talk about positive stories. Let's talk about news. Let's talk about well-balanced news. And I think, Moky, what you're doing, it's not in every piece that it's balanced. It's in general. And you are balancing the news by doing what you're doing. It's not whether your thing is positive. It's that overall we get the overall multifaceted picture.
Amazing. Thank you, Carol. You've got the quotable of the evening. Lies by omission. Would you guys mind if I took 2 Q&As that have just popped in here? In terms of defining the narrative of Africa abroad, how do you think African art and literature, especially in English and French, can be more widely read abroad and taught in schools internationally? Nobody on this one? Awkward silence.
Can I just, I feel bad saying anything about it because obviously I'm not African, so I feel like I shouldn't be the one answering, but I teach a course at a university and it's on African-led development. I teach with my husband who is African. And we recently had a thing where we brought in creatives to talk about the creative economy. And one of them was a very well-known Nollywood producer, Tope Ocean, who had done a film Up North. And so we made that an assigned thing. It's funny because I put it on with my daughter. I thought we'd watch the first 10 minutes. It's such a good story that we sat there listening to it till the end. And then I played it for my husband and we all sat there again, watching it all the way till the end. And even though we didn't need to, all the students were so moved by it. It's just really good storytelling. And it's a story that it has very Nigerian aspects to it, but it's also a global story. A story of a son who goes off and doesn't want to do what his father tells him to do and, does his own thing and discovers his country. That could be anywhere. But I think that it's somehow just getting it in front of people that some of these stories are so good. And Nollywood has done such a great job. Some of the Nollywood movies, there's some crap. There's some crap out of Hollywood. But there's some really good Nollywood stories. And if you just sit and watch those first 10 minutes, you'll watch it till the end. Somehow it's those first 10 minutes that are the challenge. I don't know how to get over that hump, but that to me is, it's amazing how good many of them really are.
Yeah. And I think, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Rachel, because I know I'm talking a lot, but I love it. I think the thing about, African art and literature in putting in school curriculums on the continent, I think that is happening. There's certain places where it's not happening, or whether there's a lot of still a lot of international stuff. But I think internationally, one of the things that we have to do is take out some of the stuff we've been teaching for years. Shakespeare is still on the curriculum. You can't kind of keep on doing what you're doing and not put in new stuff. The world is changing. The way people consume stuff is changing. My son is 16. I'll be honest with you, I don't think he's picked up a book, outside of being forced to by a teacher, because the way he consumes content is changing. So when we go think, we talk about how I learned to read and the things I read, my kids don't learn like that. And I think, it's not just about putting African literature, it's just the way we learn, the way we consume content. And that has to change. And, to be honest, African art and literature, a lot of the time, by the time it gets into a school, it's so highbrow. It is not accessible to the bulk of the continent. A lot of the African writers writing stuff. I mean, I tried reading Ben Okri, but I forced myself to read it because you have to read Ben Okri. Some of that stuff, it's not easy to read, right? And so we've got to make stuff for ourselves, right? You've got to recognize who your reader is. You've got to recognize who would buy your content. Make stuff that we will consume. And that's kind of like an overriding message. Because once we do that, then it'll get popular.
Absolutely. That authenticity and stuff, like I have this critique a lot when we think about like the award systems here in the US and people creating movies and films just to be recognized by a system that doesn't even recognize them. What do you want your peers to consume? What do you want them to know about the art that you create? How are they consuming the art that you're putting into the world? That's what we really need to be focused on. And Moky, your point about Shakespeare is so correct. There's so many things that have been released since then that would be better serving so many different communities. And to go back to that question, I think, yes, it's important to define the narrative abroad, but we have our own ownership. We have to just champion our own stories, put those in the forefront as pieces that are just as important or more important than the Shakespeares and the Thoreaus or whatever nonsense they have the children reading in schools these days. Thank you, Isabel.
Rachel, before we proceed, I just want to add that from my perspective, I studied politics, philosophy, and economics in the UK. And from that experience, I think lecturers, professors, African professors in institutions in foreign countries or in Western countries should put in an effort in putting that African art and literature in front of the students. You are in a position of power as a professor, and you have the power to change the curriculum or change what you teach to your students. And I feel like there's a lot of professors, African professors in these international universities who can do that. And I think that's probably a good starting point. Make connections to collaborate with these professors to put that work in front of students or in front of international students in international universities to market that content.
Agree.
I'd just like to add to that. You know, the people that are also kind of buying, investing in, you know, and also hosting this content are very much implicit in what is put out there. So, you know, the film publishers who go like, yeah, well, this is not really, to Carol's point, you're going native with this content. That is something that I'm pretty sure directors and storytellers hear all the time. So they kind of have to dumb down their stories just to put anything they can out there. The galleries that are not buying the art because, you know, it might be contentious or it might not necessarily feed to their audience's taste are also complicit in this problem. And I mean, I think like it's not enough for us to say that we are not creating this content. There are so many creators out there who are trying their hardest and writing these books and making this art and making the music. But if the people behind the industries are just not interested, then we either have to create our own industries or know that we will not be able to participate in the ways that we would like to. When Moky said that, you know, they're still waiting for some African funders, the first thing I thought was, well, that's disappointing because while we have the representation, we don't have the participation. And I think without participation, representation means nothing because then you'll have the people, you know, who are paying for this stuff kind of representing us in a very shallow way. And we'll never actually get to this nuanced storytelling and the good narratives because we're not even behind the facilitation of this content.
Mm.
Can I just add on? What I do want to say is that we shouldn't ignore the role of social media and that actually we as Africans control the means now. You know, we find a lot of stuff on social media, like amazing people doing stuff, and they get, you know, they suddenly get a huge following, something triggers, maybe somebody in the West has to post it, but we're using our own platforms. You know, the last panel earlier on today, we talked about Instagram and how the chef was using Instagram to show her stuff and build her brand. We don't need third-party intermediaries right now, and that's what the media is. And I think increasingly the role of media is, you know, sorry to say that, but to a certain extent with the youth in Africa, it's becoming redundant. because they are creating their own channels. They're news influencers, young people who are putting out content. Like I asked my daughter, how did you hear about X? Because I want to know what she reads. How does she consume news? She goes, oh, so-and-so put it on their thing. That's how I found out. Where did that so-and-so get it from? If it maybe somewhere down the line, somebody's parent or somebody saw it, but people are just, they're creating their own news, like the things they're interested in. They make a story out of that, but it's not, the source might ultimately be the CNN or, BBC, but a lot of people are creating content. They're making news. They're putting out memes. They're using social media. So I think that the point is that we've got to look at where things are going, because I think we've been talking about the power of the media. Yes, media is powerful, but you know what, to be honest, NSARS was not anything that the media created. That was done from it was, what's that phrase, groundswell, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Yeah, I mean, it was from the bottom up. People did that. They created the movement. They did it all on social media. It was all done by young people. And I think that that's what's exciting about the continent, that it's just, people are doing things, and we have to kind of move to where they are and say, fine, yeah, the media, we can fix that. But how do we get young people to be more positive to a certain extent about the things they see in their country and the things they talk about and the things they write about, and influencers to just not go on and on about being rich. We're not the Kardashians. There's just other things that we need to be concerned about. But yeah, I just think that there's a lot of opportunity and excitement in what's going on social media and what young Africans are doing right now.
Yes, absolutely. I am Cape Verdean, and we speak Creole, which is an undocumented dialect of Portuguese. And the way that I've been learning to read and write in Creole is following Instagram pages. You hear a language your whole life, but it's not documented anywhere. They learn to read and write in Portuguese. No one speaks Portuguese conversationally. And I tell my parents all the time, like, the fact that I can get on Instagram and learn how to read and write in Creole so that I can communicate with my family there, that's really special. And that's not something that I would have had access to maybe even 5 years ago. And I think those types of things are going to empower us to have better connection with the diaspora, to get those resources back home, to continue to let our families there know what's possible, to give them the resources where necessary, and grow from there. But Moky, you kind of asked my next question, which is, what can African youth do to ensure that they're developing into leaders who can positively shape and impact Africa's future? And what is our role in getting them ready for that, and being ready for us to pass the mic to them, which, when the time is right, which is now?
I don't think we need to pass on the mic. The youth have the mic already. Like Moky said, they have social media. They're on TikTok, they're on Instagram. Whatever popular social media platform there is, they're on it, and they are the leaders in it. I mean, you look at TikTok, the media is trying to catch up to what the youth are doing on TikTok. We are trying to fit into the youth and how they use TikTok, because the youth are the leaders on TikTok. And how we can support the youth is give them information. I think that the challenge is a lot of youth or young people don't read, or if they do read, they're not reading content that would change how they consume content. I think they're probably reading your celebrity platforms, your entertainment news, and it's rare that you will find young people focusing on contentious issues on their social media platforms. It's all about entertainment and getting that following. And as the adults in the conversation, I think we need to find ways of connecting with the youth on that front. That's how I see
air
it.
quotes. We're adults, no air quotes. We're the olds.
I'm still young. I still fall in between adult and young. So that's why I'm saying as an adult.
I don't know, Tshepo. I mean, in the spirit of not being myopic and telling a single story, I don't want to tell a single story about the youth of Africa either, because there are those who, yes, consume entertainment, but then there are also those who consume political discourse. And both of those things are important for any nation to grow and exist and be dynamic and be interesting. And I think there has never been a more fascinating time to be young right now. You know, young people are using TikTok to talk about politics. Young people are using Twitter to organize rallies and protests. I mean, if you look at the Free Palestine protest that was organized very quickly here in Johannesburg, and that was the power of social media. That was the power of young people. So I don't think the question is, how do we ensure that young people are developing into the leaders? They already are the leaders, to your point, yes. But I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, now that they have done all of this groundwork already, how can we put infrastructure behind this so that it doesn't just fall into, just kind of disappear, really, fall into oblivion? And I think that's the frustration to the young right now, is that they are raising the important issues, they are rallying, they are changing discourse, but we are not supporting them. We are not making sure that this becomes more than just discourse. We are not making sure that the hashtags become actions. There are still students whose fees are not getting paid, and where they have done all that they could, and it is now time for everybody else to step up.
That's our Mike, is figuring out how to fund their stories and how to help them get on these, use our platforms to help them get on the main stage. How do we turn hashtags into actions? That was great. I saw Obi pop in here, so I think that means that our time is almost coming to a close. Do we get can someone give me a, how much more time do we have? Thank you guys. We have another 5 minutes. Okay, that's fantastic. All right, great. So I think we've talked through a lot of different things here today. We are ourselves navigating through our own lack of resources and commitment and a lot of things, and also trying to solve those problems while setting up the youth for the future of whatever world this is going to be that they inherit, which honestly I'm very afraid of, because I don't know where we're going with this one. But is there anything here that we didn't get to touch on that you guys think is important to this conversation, that you'd like to add here?
Well, okay, let me say something.
Pardon?
One thing I will say is, oh, sorry, Tshepo, you about to speak?
No, go ahead, it's fine. I think
I was just going to say, just to go back on youth, look at us. We're not air quoting. I mean, we really are. Youth is not represented on this panel, and I see that a lot. We talk about it, and we have people, your age and my age, who talk about young people, and we should have the young people here. That's one thing. So Nkiru, let's have one. The next panel will be young people, because often it's the same people that get the platform.
Oh, Rachel, I was going to add that one thing that we probably didn't touch on is probably a challenge for many developing countries is when foreign media parachute in journalists into countries to report on news. And I think it's something that we need to call out. I think of the recent events in Myanmar, the Myanmar coup, where they parachuted a CNN journalist into the country to report, to report from the front lines, and they build this narrative, the stereotype of the white savior saving brown people. And I think it's something we as Africans need to call out when we see it happening, and that no, the African people are here to tell their own stories, allow them to tell their own stories, rather than parachuting in journalists into those countries to report from the front lines. And I think it's something that we need to be cognizant of and call out when it happens.
I'm gonna lightly disagree, because I don't think that it's in either or. I think that both things are necessary. It is necessary to have the coverage for the CNN viewers, but it also has to be balanced with an alternative source. I think the issue comes into play when that's the only narrative that we're getting is a parachute journalist.
Actually, can I add to that?
Absolutely.
Oh, having been both a parachute journalist and living in a country watching parachute journalists come in and get it oh so wrong. And I think that one of the problems, first of all, when you just come in, the parachute journalists, it is beyond them to believe that these, these people, the peasants they see on the ground, could possibly actually be organized and could know something and could have expertise far beyond what they have. That's one of the things, is the arrogance of the foreign media. But the other part is, it's not just coming in, it's who do you have that you interview. So, I mean, it should be that everybody is coming in everywhere to report on everything, right? So it's not one or the other. But when you come in, if you are an American, do you come into Africa and then look for that American spokesperson from World Food Program or the UN to tell the story, when meanwhile, that is their one foreign employee in the mission there. And all the other people who are actually delivering the food aid are Africans. And you could have asked them. But instead, and we use that little thing for color, like, oh, Mary, whatever, goes and, deals with her child. It's so sad. But then we go to the expert, the spokesperson, who often is a foreigner, the white savior. Mm-hmm. That's what is reinforcing the white saviorism. If the journalist came in and parachuted in, and we all parachuted everywhere, frankly, I really would like it if some African journalists would come and report on our elections here in America. That would be great. But, so welcome to do that. But when you come in, talk to the people who actually are there, who actually know it, and they aren't themselves parachuters. So I think that there's a distinction there. Like, that you're right, but it's not exactly that.
Absolutely.
Carol, just to say, that Larry Madoa is reporting for the BBC, and he's covering the US, and African is covering the US. So it's very interesting.
There's several here. There's several here, and it's really interesting hearing how they cover the elections. The regime here.
That's what you call it. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned so much. I'm sure we've all got a lot to take away from. I want to thank everyone who's been communicating in the chat. I'm like so in on the conversation here, listening to you guys. This has been the highlight of the day so far. So thank you all for providing this space, for giving us your time. Makura, I invite you back to the room to do the closer. I don't know if Obi is going to do that, but that's all from me. I would encourage all of you panelists, if you're interested, just to drop your either socials, if you want people to follow you, into the chat, so the conversation can continue. But I am very thankful for everything that's been shared here today.
Thank you, Rachel, for this incredible. You did a great job moderating this session. This is fantastic. Everybody, Carol, Tshepo, Moky, Khanyi, this was like really exceptional. I have to defend ourselves. There's a lot of youth in the room because, in Nigeria, youth, even when you're 60, you're still youth. So just to be sure that we say that. And then,
Who's been lying to you in Kiru? Who's been lying to you?
So I'm still in the youth league.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm youth. Rachel's youth. Khanyi's youth. Tshepo's youth. So
I claim it. I claim it.
Moky, Obi, and Carol. I don't know.
In Kiru, the African National Congress say youth ends at 36, but you can change your ID number, but that's where it ends.
I play for the I have official age, man. I play football.
No, but thank you guys. This has been incredible. I wish we could go on longer, but we only have an hour for this. So it's been incredible listening to you. I really like the whole point about regime, the American regime and all of that. So that was really cool. Carol, great point. And literally, I think we've all learned a lot. I think that whole idea that you had, Carol, which is about balancing, it's the balance of, information. I think that for me was the nugget, it was just like an aha moment where actually that's the work that Moky is trying to do. And Moky, the point you were making about, getting support from people, from the West, it's just so crucial. If only Africans will support Africans, if only we will support each other, if only Africans will invest in Africa, if we'll invest in African news. I mean, I think that's just one of the most important things to take away from this conversation. So thank you so much, everybody. You were all amazing. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. Thank you. Obi, do you want to say anything, or are we good?
No, just it was incredible. Just good to listen, and yeah, I'm just looking forward to seeing the outputs and the outcomes from everybody's work, because clearly everybody's focused on the same thing, which is about controlling and reshaping this narrative. Because I think we've all inherited mixed history, if I put it like that. And that mixed history has affected how we all see ourselves. And at the end of the day, it seems to come down to, if we can see value in ourselves, then I think we can all do better. But thank you very much, everybody. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you
so much.
Take care. Stay well.
Thank you.